before her voice faded into silence and her body turned still in the cold March of 1603. Elizabeth Tudor, once the radiant, commanding Queen of England, spent her final days in a fog of dread, isolation, and whispers. The woman once hailed as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the lioness who defied popes and monarchs, who reigned over a golden age of English culture and power, ended her life not in glory but in eerie decline. But this is not the story you'll find in polished history books or classroom retellings. This is a tale of unraveling, of a mind slowly giving way to shadows, of a monarch consumed not by illness alone, but by her own ghosts. And as we peel back the elegant courtly veneers, we begin to see a woman no longer in command, but tormented by what she could not control: age, death, and memory. Before we descend fully into that dark spiral, take a moment to subscribe to Dark Hours Archive, where history, as darkest secrets, are brought to light with nothing held back. These are the stories too disturbing for your school books and too haunting to forget. And this one, The Final Days of Elizabeth I, will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Now imagine the scene. It is the winter of 1602 turning to 1603. The Queen is 69 years old, and though that may not sound ancient today, in Tudor times it was remarkably and deeply unnatural for a ruler still clinging to power. Her body is withered. She's gaunt. Her once proud posture now curls inward. Her hair, long since gone grey, is hidden beneath elaborate red wigs, and her face is masked in a thick, ghostly layer of white lead makeup that cracks with every breath. But beyond the physical decay lies a mental erosion far more unsettling. She refuses to sleep. For days at a time, she paces the cold stone floors of Richmond Palace, refusing food, refusing rest, lost in thought or perhaps in torment. It begins with a look, not one of fear, but of vacancy. Those closest to her notice that her eyes seem locked on something no one else can see. She stares into the distance, unmoving for hours, as if replaying some event, or reliving some failure. In her mind she speaks little. Her courtiers are unnerved, but they dare not interfere, because despite her condition, Elizabeth is still queen. Her rage, when roused, is still volcanic, and her ability to punish perceived betrayal has not dulled with age. She is haunted by death, not simply the inevitability of her own, but those she caused. Mary, Queen of Scots, comes back to her in dreams. They say, executed on Elizabeth's orders in 1587, Mary's death has weighed on her conscience ever since. Though she justified it politically, many believe she never forgave herself for executing a fellow queen, a cousin, a mirror of herself. At night, in the shadows of her chambers, Elizabeth begins to whisper names, apologies, commands. Her ladies-in-waiting report that she speaks to ghosts, some from the Tower of London, some from the battlefield, and some from her own youth. And then there is Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, Elizabeth's final favourite, executed just 2 years earlier for treason after leading a failed rebellion against her. Essex had been much more than a political figure to the Queen. He was a companion, a confidant, perhaps even the echo of a love she denied herself. In these final months, she clutches the ring he once gave her. She speaks his name in the dark. Some say she saw him standing at the edge of her bed, bloodied, silent, and staring. Whether apparition or hallucination, Essex is always there, one of many spirits circling the dying queen. And the court. The court becomes a mausoleum with a crown. Gone is the radiance of Elizabeth's earlier reign. There are no pageants, no grand audiences, no music or laughter echoing down the halls. Her ministers wait, not out of loyalty, but out of calculation. For her death is imminent, and with it comes a shift in power. Behind closed doors, political maneuverings begin. Letters are sent. Messages smuggled to Scotland, because everyone knows who will succeed her, though she has never named him officially. James VI of Scotland, son of the beheaded Mary. Meanwhile, Elizabeth stops eating altogether. Her strength fades, her skin turns a pale, bluish-grey, and still she refuses to lie down. For days she stands in her chamber, propped against cushions and the backs of chairs, too afraid to rest. If I lay down, she says, I will never rise again. There's something primal in that fear, not just of dying, but of surrendering, of finally letting go of the control that defined her entire existence. So she resists, her body trembling, her mind unraveling further. No prayers soothe her, no doctor can reach her, no servant can comfort her. It is as if she is walking into the abyss with eyes wide open, refusing help, but also refusing peace. Her silence becomes terrifying. She points occasionally to empty corners of the room, as if seeing faces no one else can. and when she does speak, her voice is weak and rasping. Some believe she is confessing, others think she is bargaining with God, with death, with the countless souls she ordered killed to preserve her reign. All the while, the weather outside turns cruel, the Thames freezes in parts, the winds howl through the palace halls, and inside, the Queen of England slips closer to death-wrapped, not in dignity but in dread. Elizabeth's court had learned to fear silence, but now it was all that remained. Ministers crept like shadows through the halls, careful not to disturb the thick stillness that surrounded her. No one knew what to say anymore, and even those who had once basked in the warmth of her favor now spoke in hushed tones, not from respect, but out of deep, shivering unease. The Queen was no longer a ruler of presence, and Comanche was becoming a relic of something once divine, now decaying. Her long refusal to name a successor bred more tension with each passing hour. Her counselors, Cecil Howard, and others were torn between duty and fear, between preserving the dignity of their queen and preparing for the inevitable collapse of her reign. Yet still, Elizabeth refused to lie down. For 6 full days and nights, she stood, her thin legs trembling beneath layers of velvet and bone, refusing the bed that seemed to beckon her like a grave. Her ladies-in-waiting tried to persuade her, even begged her, tears in their eyes, voices trembling, but she pushed them away with a stare that pierced like frost. "Must is not a word to be used to princes," she once said in her youth, and now, in the hour of death, she lived by it more fiercely than ever. But her body, the once commanding vessel of a nation's power, could not obey her will forever. Her feet swelled, her fingers shook, her heart beat with irregular rhythm, too slow one moment, too fast the next. Her lips cracked beneath the weight of white lead, and beneath her eyes bloomed the deep purple shadows of insomnia and despair. Still, she stood, until she couldn't. Her knees gave way beneath her, and she collapsed silently into the arms of a servant. No scream, no cry, just surrender. They carried her, finally, to the bed she had refused, laying her down upon stiff royal sheets as though placing a relic inside a coffin. Her eyes remained open, but they did not see. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. It was as if her soul hovered at the edge of her body, not willing to leave yet, not certain what waited beyond. Outside, the court trembled. England had known only her for 44 years. Entire generations had never known another ruler. To imagine a world without Elizabeth was to imagine the end of order itself. Some believed her death would spark civil war, that rivals for the throne would rise and tear the country apart. Others whispered that her death was a punishment, a final reckoning for the blood spilled during her long and turbulent reign. In corners of the palace, priests murmured prayers over candles that sputtered and dimmed in the March winds. And still, the Queen lingered. They said she refused all food and drink, that her throat was parched, her stomach empty, yet she pushed away every offering with a twitch of her hand or a shake of her fading head. Physicians tried poultices, concoctions, even ancient remedies involving crushed pearls and rose oil, but nothing touched her decline. Her mind was no longer in the room. She had drifted somewhere between worlds. Some nights she moaned softly, words lost in breath, syllables warped beyond meaning. One lady swore she heard her whisper, "I am the shadow I feared," though no one else confirmed it. Another claimed she spoke Latin in a fevered trance, cursing and absolving her soul in the same breath. But whether these were truths or tales, one fact remained: certainly Elizabeth was not dying peacefully. She was struggling, as if dragged into death by unseen hands. And around her, those same shadows she once commanded began to consume the palace. Curtains were drawn tighter. Candles burned lower. The courtiers, dressed in darker clothes, preparing not only for mourning but for power shifts that would follow her last breath. Every footstep was muffled. Every look held suspicion. Messengers traveled in secret to Scotland, where James waited for confirmation of the inevitable. But none could bring themselves to speak it aloud in the palace. Elizabeth was dying. And in her dying, a chapter of English history was collapsing. On the 6th night, as her breathing grew shallower, her ladies brought in her old ring, a symbol of her queenship, of her promise to remain married to her people alone. They slipped it onto her thin, bony finger. It nearly fell off. The once glorious ring that gleamed in the sunlit courts of her prime now looked absurd against the corpse-like pallor of her hand. She did not react. Her eyes, sunken deep beneath waxy skin, flickered once toward the ceiling and then shut. A hush fell across the room. No one knew if she had gone. Then her chest rose against low, painful, forced. Not yet. Outside her chamber, the guards shifted uneasily. The wind screamed through the gaps in the stonework. Somewhere deep in the palace, a tapestry fell from the wall. An omen, a coincidence, none dared guess. The courtiers awaited the signal that had not yet come. the moment history would turn its page. And Elizabeth, England's longest reigning monarch, hovered between life and legend. They say that on the seventh day, she opened her eyes one last time, that she looked around the room at those gathered nobles, servants, priests, and saw not the people they were, but reflections of the lives she had touched and destroyed, that her gaze passed over every face like a final judgment, that no one could hold her eyes for long. Some say she whispered something then, a name perhaps, or a regret. Others claim she said nothing at all, that she simply exhaled once, and then, nothing. But it was not yet the end. The sun rose on Richmond Palace, but no one opened the windows. Light was not welcome in those corridors where death hovered like incense. Elizabeth lay still, her frame barely making an impression in the bed that once cradled the most powerful woman in Europe. Yet, as her courtiers and physicians drew close to confirm what they already suspected, they were met not with finality but with persistence. She was still breathing, faint, staggered, but still. The Queen clung to life like a ghost refusing to pass. For hours, her chest rose and fell, each breath slower, each interval more dreadful. The silence was no longer respectful. It was unbearable. There was no dignity now, no majesty, just waiting for the inevitable. But death, it seemed, had its own patience. Elizabeth, even in her final ruin, would not surrender quickly. This too was a kind of power, a defiance not in sword or decree, but in sheer endurance. She had ruled for 44 years, outlasted countless enemies, and built an empire on her name alone. If death thought it could take her easily, it was mistaken. Yet this was no victory. There was nothing glorious in it, only horror. Her attendants whispered prayers through their teeth, while others whispered speculation. Was this agony her punishment, her purgatory for the blood on her hands, the lives she had ordered extinguished? Or was this merely the consequence of a soul that had burned so brightly for so long it could not find its way to darkness? By the evening of the seventh day, her hands had curled into claws. Her skin, once powdered and perfumed for courtly charm, was yellowed, brittle, almost translucent. Her jaw hung open, and yet her eyes refused to close. That, more than anything, unnerved them. Elizabeth stared upward, unblinking, unseeing, or perhaps seeing far too much. A bishop attempted to speak to her, leaning close, murmuring rites and scripture. She did not react, but when he asked if she died in the faith of Christ, they swore she moved her lips. No sound, just movement, a nod, a farewell. The signal the court had waited for. Still, no one dared move, until finally, the breath stopped. For real. The room held still for a heartbeat longer, then another, then too many. She did not inhale again. And then the realization passed like frost through every person present. The Queen was dead. Elizabeth Tudor, monarch, warrior, icon, was no more. And yet, no one moved. It was not triumph, not grief. It was paralysis, as though the death of one woman had pulled the very gravity out of the room. But history has no time for mourning. Within minutes, the machine turned. The death was confirmed privately among her closest counselors, and even before the body cooled, a messenger was already on horseback, galloping towards Scotland. James would be king now. The Virgin Queen had died, and in her place would rise a man born of a beheaded woman. The irony was bitter, but the transition needed to appear seamless. Elizabeth had never named James in public, but she had nodded. They claimed that was enough. It had to be, because if not, all hell might follow. Still, the body had to be treated, prepared, preserved. Royal death was not a personal affair, was political theater. Her remains were an artifact now, to be displayed, marched, mourned, and buried with symbolism thick as incense. Her ladies, trembling, began the work. They dressed her in the royal funeral shroud, combed her wig, reapplied her white makeup. They worked in silence, as though she might wake again and punish them. But she would not. The breath was truly gone. And yet, even in death, she retained a kind of power, her figure lying in state, watched day and night by guards who avoided her gaze. As word of her death spread, England itself seemed to hold its breath. Bells tolled, but not with triumph, more like warnings. Across the countryside, people wept, not just for a monarch, but for the end of something larger than a life, an era, a symbol, a queen who, despite all, had held a nation together through fire and blood, and now she was dust. Rumors blossomed like mold. Some said she died cursing the world, others that she welcomed death with a lover's sigh. A few claimed her ghost remained in Richmond, forever pacing the cold floors, reliving her final sleepless nights. No one agreed, no one ever would. Because the truth of a monarch's death is never one truth. It fractures, multiplies. The funeral, when it came, was no ordinary ritual. It was a pageant of mourning. Black drapery hung from every visible stone. Priests dressed in solemn vestments, nobles rode in silence, their eyes cast down, not from sorrow, but fear. Because Elizabeth had ruled with such force that even in death she haunted them. Every decision they made now would be judged against her legacy. Every whisper would echo her silence. And as her body was taken from Richmond to Westminster, the streets lined with peasants, all standing in dead quiet, they saw not a corpse, but a memory of strength, of severity, of something they did not fully understand but knew they had lost. Her coffin was covered in purple velvet, the royal standard draped across it, and a wax effigy of her crowned figure placed atop. Soldiers marched, choirs sang, but the music could not dispel the chill, because beneath the finery lay a woman who had died alone, whispering to ghosts, refusing comfort. That image would not leave them. It would outlast every hymn, every salute, and in the hearts of those who remembered her, the tale of her final days would become more than legend. It would become a question. What does power give you when death comes? What legacy do you leave when the throne is empty, and the world you ruled moves on? And what they feared most was this: that no one, not even Gloriana, escaped the dark. They called her the Virgin Queen, but in death Elizabeth I became something more spectral than sovereign, more symbol than soul. The legends began almost instantly, swelling in the gaps where facts ended and fear began. In taverns and manor houses, they whispered that her body had turned cold days before the court admitted it, that her soul had hovered over the Thames, unwilling to cross, clinging to the dying embers of power. Others claimed that her face had hardened into something unnatural, her famed beauty, her mask of lead and rouge, cracking into a grotesque grimace, as if her body had refused peace even in its final stillness. Yet these stories, morbid as they were, served a deeper purpose. They helped the people understand how someone so mighty, so revered, could fall into the arms of death, just like anyone else. And in that understanding, they found something even more terrifying. But no crown, no icon, no divine right could protect you from the slow rot of the end. But Elizabeth's final performance wasn't quite over. Her body lay in state. The court was transformed into a theater of ritual and choreography. Mourning became a spectacle: measured tears, scripted lamentations, coordinated processions. The wax effigy they created of her, poised and regal, bore little resemblance to the ravaged figure that had wasted away in the weeks before. It wasn't just a tribute, it was propaganda, a necessary illusion to preserve the myth of Elizabeth the Eternal, even as her real form had crumbled into mortality. The effigy smiled with sculpted calm, while the corpse beneath the velvet rotted slowly in its royal casing. But the people didn't see the decay. They saw the pageantry, and they believed, because they needed to. As the body was moved through the streets toward Westminster, something strange happened. The people who had feared her, obeyed her, sometimes even hated her, wept. Some fell to their knees, others threw flowers into the path of the funeral train. They weren't mourning a monarch, they were mourning certainty. For most of them, she had simply always been there. She had outlived popes, kings, revolutions. She had faced down assassins, plotted the deaths of traitors, and raised a crumbling kingdom into a European power. To imagine a world without her was to imagine a world without foundation, and beneath that grief lurked a deeper terror. What comes next? James VI of Scotland had already been declared her successor. He would become James I of England, and though the transition was peaceful in appearance, it carried the quiet tremor of a fault line. Elizabeth's courtiers, so long accustomed to her moods and methods, were now forced to reckon with a new ruler, new politics, new fears. Some adjusted, others were cast aside, and yet, none of them could forget the final weeks of Elizabeth's life, nor the dread that had soaked the palace walls. Even those loyal to James understood that they were walking across the bones of an empire forged by her will alone. But Elizabeth's legacy wasn't written in the stone of palaces or the ink of decrees. It was written in fear, in awe, in the strange, unsettling power she held over everyone around her. Even in illness, even in the slow unraveling of her mind, she ruled. No one dared question her. No one dared comfort her without permission. Her final refusal to name a successor publicly had not been stubbornness, it had been control. Her last act of dominion. She wanted the world to know that even death would not loosen her grip on the throne, that the crown would not pass until her breath had stopped, and in that she succeeded. Some claimed that Elizabeth knew exactly how her death would be remembered. but she orchestrated it with the same precision she used to command her realm. The long refusal to sleep, the muttering to ghosts, the public decline that blurred the line between woman and wraith. It was a story she authored in silence, a final drama in a life filled with performance. But others insist it was not controlled at all. But she was afraid that beneath the layers of power and image, there was only a lonely, broken woman haunted by regret, by blood, by the absence of love. A queen who died as she lived, alone in a room full of people who could never truly know her. The truth lies somewhere in the shadow between those two visions, and perhaps that is why her final days are still so captivating. They are not just about death, they are about the collapse of myth, about what happens when a figure built of marble and fire is reduced to flesh and decay. And what we see, in that collapse, is not weakness but humanity, terrifying, raw, and real. Inside Westminster Abbey, where her body was finally entombed, the choir sang solemn verses that echoed off ancient stone. The mourners bowed their heads. The crown was placed beside her, no longer hers, but still heavy with her name. And somewhere in the silence that followed, they say, a candle guttered for no reason. A whisper moved through the air. Just a breeze, some said. Others, less certain, looked toward the crypt and felt something watching, something unwilling to rest. The stone that sealed Elizabeth's tomb was thick, heavy, and final, but it couldn't smother the myths that had already begun to bloom in the silence she left behind. Even as the echoes of her funeral still hung in the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey, her memory twisted itself into something far larger and far more terrifying than the woman who had once ruled. The world no longer saw her as merely a monarch, they saw her as a spectre, a warning, a tragic emblem of power's final cost. In the months that followed her death, tales of her ghost wandering the halls of Richmond and Whitehall spread like rot through the court. Servants swore they heard her heels clicking against the flagstones long after nightfall, echoing in corridors. No one dared enter alone. Some claimed she was searching for Essex, forever calling his name. Others said she simply paced, sleepless as ever, unable to rest even in death. James I, her successor, dismissed the stories in public, but he could not fully dispel the shadow she cast over his new reign. He inherited the throne, yes, but not the aura, not the fear, not the grip Elizabeth had held over her people. Every decision he made was silently compared to what Elizabeth would have done. Her policies, her resolve, even her cruelty became standards against which he was judged. In life, she had dominated her court. In death, she dominated memory. And that was perhaps her most unsettling legacy. The way she had transformed herself into an idea. Something eternal, even as her body withered into dust. But those closest to her, those who had watched her final descent into madness and silence, knew the truth behind the legend. They remembered the trembling hands, the glassy eyes, the way her voice faltered and faded. They remembered the fear in her attendants' eyes as they begged her to sleep. The way she refused, not out of pride, but terror. And above all, they remembered how she spoke to people who weren't there. Names long dead, accusations whispered into the air, regrets she would never admit aloud. These were not the markings of a deity. They were the unraveling of a woman who had spent too long wearing a crown too heavy for any mortal. And still, despite this intimate decay, the nation clung to the image of Gloriana, the queen who defeated the Spanish Armada, the sovereign who presided over Shakespeare, Raleigh, and Drake, the ruler who never married, never bowed, never gave in. The contradiction was jarring and it made her more mythical still. She had been a woman who ruled like a man, but died with the frailty of every broken human heart. In that paradox, the public found something hauntingly beautiful and terrifying, because it meant that even the greatest among them were not spared the slow, humiliating crawl toward death. Years later, poets would immortalize her with flourishes of grandeur, painting her as a goddess in human form. Portraits commissioned posthumously depicted her with impossible youth, ageless skin, eyes filled with knowing fire, but beneath each stroke of paint was a desperate attempt to forget the truth, to erase the memory of her body collapsing inward, her eyes empty and searching, her refusal to eat, her skeletal fingers twitching under layers of silk, her lips stained with lead, her final words, if they were ever truly spoken, drowned in speculation and embellished with meaning. But the truth, as always, was darker, more human, more painful. And perhaps that's why her final days remain among the most terrifying chapters in English royal history, because they remind us that no amount of ceremony, no legacy of conquest or culture, no myth of virginity or divine favor, can protect the soul from itself. Elizabeth's death was not heroic, it was not even noble, it was slow, it was ugly, it was real, She died as she lived alone, misunderstood, surrounded by power but untouched by comfort. Even now, centuries later, visitors to Westminster Abbey pass her tomb and feel something shift in the air, a chill, a pressure, a silence that does not belong to the stones alone. Some say her eyes still linger there, watching the living with the same piercing gaze she once turned on traitors and lovers alike. Others believe her soul never left the palace walls, trapped in the liminal space between myth and mortality. And when the wind howls through old corridors and the candles flicker without warning, they say you can still hear the faint whisper of a queen who could not sleep, and never will. The weeks following Elizabeth's burial were not marked by peace, but by a persistent disquiet that no proclamation from the new king could silence. The people of England had not simply lost a monarch, they had lost a symbol, a presence, a force, that for nearly half a century had defined the rhythm of the realm. And in the void she left behind, rumors grew like mold on damp stone. Even among those who had never seen her in life, her absence was palpable. In marketplaces, in chapels, in alleyways, the same questions circled in low tones. Had she died well? Had she repented? Was she truly at rest? Those closest to her knew the answers were far more disturbing, for they had seen the mask slip, the image of Elizabeth, the eternal crown, poised. Serene had been a fragile illusion in her final weeks, barely held together by powder and performance. What remained beneath that veneer was not the mighty lioness of England, but a withered woman trembling in the dark, too afraid to close her eyes, too proud to show weakness, and too haunted to find sleep. She had spent her life mastering image, wielding symbolism like a weapon, and yet when the end came, none of it could shield her from the terrible intimacy of death. The courtiers who had once basked in her attention now spoke only in cautious tones about her final days. They rarely used her name, as though it might still summon her. In secret journals and coded letters, they hinted at what they had witnessed: the sleepless pacing, the vacant stares, the whispered names of the dead. Some feared that if these truths were made public, it would tarnish the very fabric of English glory. Others believed that by revealing her final decline, they could finally reclaim their own humanity from beneath the weight of her long shadow. But none could deny what they had seen. One servant confessed years later that he would often wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, hearing her voice calling from behind closed doors, begging to be left alone, weeping like a child. Another claimed he had once passed her chamber and found her crouched in the corner, murmuring to a spot on the wall, tears streaking her white-painted face, her crown resting beside her on the floor like an abandoned relic. These stories, passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, became part of the oral folklore surrounding Gloriana's end. It wasn't just death that haunted the palace, it was the spectacle of a monarch losing control. And for a nation raised to believe in divine right, in majesty without flaw, this image was more terrifying than any battlefield or plague. It suggested that power could corrode from within, that the same force which had lifted her above others had slowly hollowed her out, until only performance remained. And when even that failed her, what was left was not a queen but a frightened woman in a darkened room. The priests who had been summoned to perform the final rites spoke of a kind of spiritual resistance. Elizabeth, they said, would not receive communion, would not utter the prayers, would not allow the usual rituals of passage, whether out of pride, fear, or confusion. She rejected the sacraments with the same stubbornness with which she had once rejected suitors and advisers. It was as though she intended to defy even God, or at least negotiate with him on her own terms. But to the clergy, this was not strength, it was spiritual peril. Some whispered that her soul was now restless, caught between this world and the next, neither damned nor saved, forever circling the place where her body had fallen. Meanwhile, James I settled into his throne with increasing discomfort. The shadow of Elizabeth loomed over every ceremony, every decree, every royal visit. He had inherited the crown, but not the reverence. Wherever he went, portraits of the Virgin Queen remained, their eyes seeming to judge him from the canvas, cold and eternal. He ordered some removed, replaced others with his own image, but the people did not forget. In fact, they clung to her memory more fiercely in her absence, casting her as the golden standard by which all others would be measured and found wanting. And so, Elizabeth's afterlife began not in heaven or hell, but in the collective psyche of a people who both revered and feared her. She became a kind of mythological creature, both divine and monstrous, a woman who had ruled with brilliance and brutality, who had loved no one and yet belonged to everyone, who had built an empire and died whispering to ghosts. Her story could not be tidied into a neat ending. It lingered, like the echo of footsteps down an empty hall, It bled through tapestries and court records, through paintings and plays, through the stones of the very palaces she once commanded. And in that lingering presence lay her truest power, not in the battles she won or the treaties she signed, but in the terror she left behind. The terror of a legacy that refused to fade. The terror of a woman who had become something more than human and something far more frightening. Time marched forward, but the air around Elizabeth's legacy never cleared. Even years after her body had turned to dust, the silence she left behind continued to speak in tremors, shaping the psychology of every monarch who came after her. James I ruled with intellect, yes, but also with a quiet and constant anxiety, as if he feared that the moment he relaxed his grip, her ghost would return to reclaim what he had borrowed. In staterooms and private chambers, her name was spoken with caution. Her symbols, gloves, pearls, the Tudor rose were still visible, carved into the architecture, woven into the cloth of banners, embedded in the ceremonial rituals of the crown, and yet no one dared speak of her death directly. It was a wound covered by velvet, a secret embalmed in stone. At Richmond Palace, where she had spent her last conscious days, servants still avoided the upper chambers. They claimed that on certain nights, especially in late March, the sound of pacing footsteps echoed above the ceiling beams, long, slow, measured, as if someone was still refusing to rest. Doors that had been locked were found slightly ajar. Candles, freshly snuffed, would relight themselves with no breeze in the room. One maid reported seeing a woman in white staring out the window of the Queen's former chamber, her posture eerily still, her face lost to shadow. But when others investigated, the room was empty except for the faint smell of lavender, Elizabeth's favorite perfume. And still, her memory was not treated with tenderness. It was revered, yes, but not with warmth, not with comfort. Elizabeth was no saint. She had ordered executions with a flick of her hand. She had imprisoned her cousin Mary and signed her death warrant without flinching. She had used love as a weapon, trust as bait, and silence as a blade. Her courtiers never truly knew her. They loved her with terror. They obeyed her with devotion, born not of affection, but awe. Even her most trusted advisers, Burleigh, Walsingham, had learned to walk carefully in her presence, never sure which side of the Queen they would meet. In death, this caution persisted. No monument, no poem, no royal decree dared diminish her, because to do so felt dangerous, as if her very name still carried the power to curse. But while Elizabeth's death cast a long shadow over England's monarchy, it also seeded a darker truth in the collective soul of her people, the realization that glory was temporary, and power could be beautiful and horrifying in the same breath. For the common folk, her reign had often felt distant, her decisions made behind curtains of velvet and steel. Yet in her decline, she became strangely relatable, mortal, vulnerable, and in that, there was a grim comfort. If even Gloriana could fall, then perhaps suffering was not a punishment, but a condition shared by all. Writers and playwrights of the era began weaving her image into their work, sometimes in open tribute, other times as veiled commentary. Her downfall was used to explore the limits of power, the madness of isolation, the consequence of believing oneself chosen by divine right. And while the official chronicles praised her to the heavens, the underground stories told a more haunting tale. Queen who had ruled alone, loved no one, trusted few, and in the end died surrounded by people she could not reach. Some versions of the story became darker still. Whispers emerged that she had seen visions in her final hours, not of saints, but of the condemned. That she cried out not for salvation, but for forgiveness from the shadows that crowded her chamber. That her last word was not a prayer, but a name, perhaps Essex, perhaps Dudley, perhaps someone unknown to history. That her ring, that sacred emblem of her marriage to the nation, had grown so loose on her finger that it fell off before burial, as though the union had finally dissolved. None of this could be confirmed, but none of it could be denied either. And so, Elizabeth became a ghost of contradictions, a sovereign of strength and solitude, a woman whose greatest weapon had always been control, undone in the end by the one force she could not command. And this is perhaps what makes her death so terrifying, not the darkness of the room, not the silence of her courtiers, not the refusal to eat or sleep, but the realization that she saw it coming, that she knew, that for all her intelligence, her foresight, her ruthless calculation, she could not outwit the shadow waiting at the edge of her bed. And so she stood, for hours, for days, refusing to lay down, not because she believed she could avoid death, but because standing was the only act of defiance left to her. And even now, in the quiet corners of English history, you can feel her presence, not in the grandeur of her achievements, but in the quiet horror of her end, in the sound of a door closing softly, in the flicker of a candle in an empty room, in the cold stone beneath a royal tomb that still draws curious eyes and hushed voices. Elizabeth I may have died centuries ago, but her final days, her final resistance, her final fear, continue to echo. The Elizabethan court had always revolved around her gravity. Every gesture, every silence, every smile or frown from the Queen could shift alliances, end careers, ignite scandals. But once she was gone, once the velvet cushions no longer bore her weight, the machinery she had held together with sheer will began to creak. The nobles who once trembled before her gaze found themselves adrift in a new era where her iron presence no longer dictated the rhythm of the court. And still, no one could speak openly of her end. It was too raw, too strange, too terrifying. They spoke of her brilliance, of course of Tilbury, of Gloriana, of the Virgin Queen who defied empires. But behind closed doors, in the moments between ceremony and sleep, the true memory haunted them. The memory of her pacing the cold floors, her lips cracked, eyes wide and distant. The days she spent standing, unwashed, whispering to no one. The way the palace smelled of decay and lavender. Her final moments had not been regal, they had been human. Painfully, disturbingly human. James, I ordered no grand statues to be erected in her honor. Some said he feared her memory might overshadow his reign. Others believed he simply didn't understand what she had been to England. She had been more than monarch, she had been a presence, a phantom stitched into the very fabric of the nation. And now, with her gone, the court moved like a body missing its head, uncertain and cautious, fearing the empty air where her voice used to echo. Even the architecture seemed to remember her. The throne she once occupied felt colder. Somehow, the corridors she haunted grew quieter. Her bedchambers remained sealed for weeks, as if opening them too soon might let something unholy slip out. When they finally dared to enter, they found her belongings untouched, gloves still laid upon the table. A mirror turned inward, as if it too could no longer bear to reflect the woman who once gazed into it. Her final garments, stained with sweat and age, were carefully catalogued, but no one dared dispose of them. They remained locked away, sacred and terrible, relics of a queen who had become something between saint and spectre. Some servants refused to return to Richmond at all. One footman claimed he heard her voice humming through the rafters, the same lullaby she'd been known to murmur in the hours before dawn. Another said he'd seen a pale hand reach through the curtain in the chapel, even though no one was inside. These stories were dismissed by the new court, but not forgotten, because the truth, even when hidden beneath protocol and prayer, does not die with the body. It lingers, unsettled, just like the soul they feared had never found rest. In the countryside, commoners began to fashion charms bearing her initials, believing that Elizabeth's spirit still had power to ward off evil. Mothers whispered her name over their babies at night. Soldiers kept portraits of her in their packs. Her legend bled into magic, into folklore, into something both feared and revered. And yet, even this reverence was laced with dread, because no one could shake the final image of a queen refusing comfort, staring into nothing, dragging her body toward a death she had foreseen but could not soften. Historians would argue for centuries about what truly happened in those final days. Was it madness? Was it guilt? Was it the unraveling of a life lived too long in isolation and control? Or had she seen something beyond the veil, something that pulled her from rest and sleep? Theories rose like smoke, thick and endless. But the one truth that no one could escape was this: Elizabeth did not die quietly. She did not go gently. Her death was not peaceful. It was a storm breaking within stone walls, a slow and terrifying surrender. And perhaps that is what makes her story endure: not the power, not the speeches, not the golden age that bore her name, but the image of a monarch facing her end without armor. Because in those final days, Elizabeth I became what she had never allowed herself to be in life: unprotected, alone. And yet even then, she did not scream, she did not beg, she did not plead. She simply stood, stared, and waited. What she saw in those last hours, no one will ever know. Whether it was the faces of the condemned or the ghosts of the lovers she had lost. Whether it was the reckoning of a soul burdened by too many secrets. Or perhaps she saw nothing at all. Perhaps the terror was in the silence, in the realization that, after everything, she would pass like anyone else into darkness, unnamed, untouched. But the world did not forget, and the darkness she entered was not complete. For even now, in hushed tones, in stone halls, in the flickering corners of forgotten rooms, her story is still told, not in light, but in shadow. The Elizabethan court had always revolved around her gravity. Every gesture, Every silence, every smile or frown from the Queen could shift alliances, end careers, ignite scandals. But once she was gone, once the velvet cushions no longer bore her weight, the machinery she had held together with sheer will began to creak. The nobles who once trembled before her gaze found themselves adrift in a new era where her iron presence no longer dictated the rhythm of the court. And still, no one could speak openly of her end. It was too raw, too strange, too terrifying. They spoke of her brilliance, of course of Tilbury, of Gloriana, of the Virgin Queen who defied empires. But behind closed doors, in the moments between ceremony and sleep, the true memory haunted them. The memory of her pacing the cold floors, her lips cracked, eyes wide and distant. The days she spent standing, unwashed, whispering to no one. The way the palace smelled of decay and lavender. Her final moments had not been regal, they had been human. Painfully, disturbingly human. James, I ordered no grand statues to be erected in her honor. Some said he feared her memory might overshadow his reign. Others believed he simply didn't understand what she had been to England. She had been more than monarch, she had been a presence, a phantom stitched into the very fabric of the nation. And now, with her gone, the court moved like a body missing its head, uncertain and cautious, fearing the empty air where her voice used to echo. Even the architecture seemed to remember her. The throne she once occupied felt colder. Somehow, the corridors she haunted grew quieter. Her bedchambers remained sealed for weeks, as if opening them too soon might let something unholy slip out. When they finally dared to enter, they found her belongings untouched, gloves still laid upon the table, a mirror turned inward, as if it too could no longer bear to reflect the woman who once gazed into it. Her final garments, stained with sweat and age, were carefully catalogued, but no one dared dispose of them. They remained locked away, sacred and terrible, relics of a queen who had become something between saint and spectre. Some servants refused to return to Richmond at all. One footman claimed he heard her voice humming through the rafters, the same lullaby she'd been known to murmur in the hours before dawn. Another said he'd seen a pale hand reach through the curtain in the chapel, even though no one was inside. These stories were dismissed by the new court, but not forgotten, because the truth, even when hidden beneath protocol and prayer, does not die with the body. It lingers, unsettled, just like the soul they feared had never found rest. In the countryside, commoners began to fashion charms bearing her initials, believing that Elizabeth's spirit still had power to ward off evil. Mothers whispered her name over their babies at night. Soldiers kept portraits of her in their packs. Her legend bled into magic, into folklore, into something both feared and revered. And yet, even this reverence was laced with dread, because no one could shake the final image of a queen refusing comfort, staring into nothing, dragging her body toward a death she had foreseen but could not soften. Historians would argue for centuries about what truly happened in those final days. Was it madness? Was it guilt? Was it the unraveling of a life lived too long in isolation and control? Or had she seen something beyond the veil, something that pulled her from rest and sleep? Theories rose like smoke, thick and endless. But the one truth that no one could escape was this: Elizabeth did not die quietly. She did not go gently. Her death was not peaceful. It was a storm breaking within stone walls, a slow and terrifying surrender. And perhaps that is what makes her story endure. Not the power, not the speeches, not the golden age that bore her name, but the image of a monarch facing her end without armor. Because in those final days, Elizabeth I became what she had never allowed herself to be, in life vulnerable, unprotected, alone. And yet even then, she did not scream, she did not beg, she did not plead. She simply stood, stared, and waited. What she saw in those last hours, no one will ever know. Whether it was the faces of the condemned, or the ghosts of the lovers she had lost. Whether it was the reckoning of a soul burdened by too many secrets, or perhaps she saw nothing at all. Perhaps the terror was in the silence, in the realization that, after everything, she would pass like anyone else into darkness, unnamed, untouched. But the world did not forget, and the darkness she entered was not complete. For even now, in hushed tones, in stone halls, in the flickering corners of forgotten rooms, her story is still told, not in light, but in shadow. Even now, centuries later, the story of Elizabeth's death continues to haunt. Historians debate the symptoms, the timeline, the witnesses, but all the cold facts in the world cannot strip the narrative of its fear, because what Elizabeth left behind was not just an empire, not just a legacy, it was a question, a quiet, creeping, terrifying question that lingers in the corridors of royal history like a whisper behind a locked door. What happens when someone who ruled with myth dies with nothing but silence? Her tomb in Westminster Abbey is grand, yes, carved in marble and Latin and gold. She rests beside her sister Mary, whom she once imprisoned. The irony is thick, nearly absurd. Two sisters who tore England apart, now forever inches from each other in death. But the silence of the tomb betrays nothing of what came before. The grief, the resistance, the fear that played out in those final days does not echo beneath the stone. Only the living carry it. Only the stories. Only the eyes of those who walk past her monument and shiver, though the air is still. Elizabeth, I was many things: politician, warrior, poet, enigma. She was called the mother of her people, though she bore no children. She ruled as a woman in a man's world, never marrying, never yielding, never stepping aside. And yet, in her last days, stripped of power and voice, she became something even more frightening. A mirror, a reminder that all the majesty in the world cannot hold back the dark. She became a reflection of our deepest fears: aging, solitude, irrelevance, of watching the world we built continue without us, of knowing that the stories we told about ourselves might outlive us, but never protect us, of standing alone in a palace filled with ghosts, and knowing that none will follow us into the grave. In her final silence, Elizabeth spoke more loudly than she ever had before, and perhaps that is why her ending still unnerves. It's not simply the image of a queen refusing food, or light, or comfort. It's the fact that we saw her crumble, that we saw the veil lifted, that the monarch who had played her role with such perfection finally, terrifyingly, stepped off the stage and, beneath the crown, was not a goddess, not a saint, not a legend, just a woman, frail, frightened, still fighting. And in that final fight we find the truth of her reign. It was never just about power. It was about endurance, about the impossible burden of keeping a kingdom together with little more than presence and fear. And in her death she left behind not just a memory, but a message, that no one, not even a queen, can rule the silence. So if you still feel her presence, in the cold corners of a palace or the flicker of candlelight, it's because she never truly left. She doesn't linger to haunt us. She lingers because she was never done. Because her legacy was not in how she lived, but in how she died. And maybe, just maybe, she never meant to rest. If this story unsettled you, good. That means you're paying attention. History isn't always glorious. Sometimes, it's terrifying. If you want more forgotten truths, more stories that sleep in the shadows, more voices echoing from behind palace walls, subscribe to Dark Hours Archive right now. We uncover what others would rather bury. New videos weekly. Let the past disturb your peace. We'll be waiting.